Our speaker this evening is Kaiama Glover, Professor of French and Africana Studies at Barnard College. She's also taught at the University of Virginia and at Stanford University. Professor Glover has undergraduate degrees, a BA in French History and Literature and Afro-American Studies from Harvard University. She studied here in Paris at the Sorbonne and at the École Normale Supérieure, and she earned a PhD in French and Romance Philology from Columbia University. She's been the recipient of fellowships and awards from the Fulbright Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, the New York Public Library, the Penn Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. And this year, she is a fellow at the Institute for Ideas and Imagination. Professor Glover is the author of Haiti Unbound, a spiralist challenge to the post-colonial canon, which appeared in 2010, and very numerous articles in a variety of journals and edited volumes, both disciplinary and transdisciplinary. She was co-editor of Marie Vieux-Chauvet, Paradoxes of the Post-Colonial Feminine, which was published as a special issue of Yale French Studies in 2016. She also edited Order, Disorder, and Freedom, an homage to Maryse Condé for the Romantic Review. Professor Glover has made a major contribution with her translations of major works from French into English, including Franck Etienne's Ready to Burst in 2014, Marie Chauvet's Dance on the Volcano, 2016, and René Depestre, Hadriana in All My Dreams, which came out in 2017. She also is the author of a forthcoming book entitled Disorderly Women on Caribbean Community and the Ethics of Self-Regard. Professor Glover works extensively in the digital humanities. Indeed, this is part of the work she's doing this year at the Institute, both as founding co-editor of a new journal, Essex Archipelagos, a small acts platform for digital practice, and as co-director of the Digital Humanities Project In the Same Boats toward an Afro-Atlantic intellectual cartography. And I would like to mention that at the end of her talk, when we have our discussion, please make use of the microphones that will be passed around, and please note for your interest in her books, at the back of the room, the Red Wheelbarrow is selling copies of Professor Glover's books. This evening, Professor Glover will speak on her current research project at the Institute, René Depestre, From Haiti to Moscow with Love.
Thank you. Wow. Introductions can be really, really nice. Thank you for that, Susan. But yes, I do want to say thank you to everyone for being here tonight, this very cold night. To everyone here at the Institute, not just my fellow fellows who have been amazing and inspiring, but also obviously to the people here who make the Institute run so beautifully for all of us, Grant and Yves and Marie. Being here at the Institute in Europe, I have to use this, it's new, I have to use this. Being here at the Institute in Europe, in Paris right now, has been a privilege and a gift. I have been blown away by the folks I've gotten to meet and exchange ideas with here, the human and the intellectual connections I've had the chance to forge and to deepen. Even though both my personal and professional lives have brought me here to Paris most years, a few days here, a couple weeks there, even 1 or 2 whole summers, this has been the first time since grad school that I've really lived a life here, like packed up a lot of my stuff and called this place home. And I've come back to a lot of things here, old friends, old haunts, old rhythms, plenty of familiar places and faces, but of course a lot has changed, a lot that makes living here feel very different now. Obviously I have tons more stuff this time around, like the 2 kids, for example. But beyond any personal logistical differences, the climate here in Paris, in France, and frankly in Europe more broadly, feels very different from what it was back in the late 90s. For one thing, back then, the European Union was feeling pretty pleased with itself. The Maastricht Treaty had just come into effect in '93, a few years prior to my arrival, and France, along with Germany, was one of its 2 principal architects. An optimistic, even quasi-utopian language and feeling, if not the actual reality of openness and possible connection, had emerged, at least to my foreigners' ears and eyes. And then also, it's worth noting, I had gone back home to the States well before September 11th, and well before the 2005 popular uprisings in banlieue communities across France 4 years later. In other words, before the stage was set for the France I've returned to live in now. set for the rise of the conservative right and the National Front, for the rise of shameless xenophobia and a seemingly unending state of emergency. Being here now at home in Paris and at home in this Institute for Ideas and Imagination has been at once deeply, literally delightful and also unsettling, more or less so depending on the headlines on any given morning. Because, of course, the passport privilege and the so efficient Columbia infrastructure that's been facilitating my at-homeness here, awash in luxurious thinking and imagining, makes something of a stark contrast with the increasingly right-leaning isolationist zeitgeist, the often racist thinking, and wild lack of imagination that's so much a part of the daily real here and throughout Europe. And this contrast has colored the ways I've been approaching the work I came here to do. It's placed a certain kind of frame around my research. What I mean is that being here these last months has encouraged me to bring to bear on this project other work I've been doing, other preoccupations I've had. Specifically, prior to coming here, I'd been thinking and lecturing and publishing a bit on the pernicious ways that phenomena of refugeeism, exile, and other coerced displacements have long been and continue to be constitutive of Afro identity on a global scale. Because, of course, before there was what we're calling since 2010 the migrant crisis here in Europe, there have been many, many, many other instances of populations obliged to leave beloved homes for hostile shores. Many instances where the inhabitants of those hostile shores tell unkind stories about those fleeing their uninhabitable homes, stories that are degrading, dehumanizing, or downright untrue. A few years back, just after the January 2010 earthquake that devastated Haiti and sent once again dispossessed and desperate Haitians off on more and less dangerous journeys toward possible new homes, Haitian feminist anthropologist Gina Ulysse launched this thing that's become sort of a rallying cry in Haitian studies, sort of mantra for the entirety of our field. Haiti needs new narratives. Just that. Haiti needs new narratives. It's a simple point, but an enormously important one, given the extent to which, as we all well know, the stories we tell, our narratives, often stand in for truth. The stories that circulate about migrants, stories both textual and visual, tend to portray them as indistinct and needful hordes of wretched, not quite humanity, abject in what we call their resilience. And even when we do manage to extract an individual from the crowd, the narrative of black and brown suffering remains, a drowned toddler on a Turkish beach. So while from the beginning I've meant for this project to trace the extraordinary multi-continental peregrinations of Haitian essayist, novelist, militant socialist activist, and poet René Depestre, I've come to frame this story not only as an intellectual biography, but also as a story of generative movement, a story that pushes back against the more typical narratives of abjection that tend to attach to Haitian bodies in motion. Part of what I'm asking myself is what forms of storytelling most responsibly and compellingly translate in the sense of carrying across borders and rendering legible. What forms of storytelling best translate these narratives? What possibilities exist for representing and perceiving Black movement otherwise? So I'm going to ask your indulgence here. I've been invited to have ideas and imagination, so I'm doing something that I've never really done before, which is give a talk where I just tell a story about someone I find interesting. I'm much more used to theorizing than storytelling. But it's early days for this project, and as of now, I'm trying to do kind of a lot in it. I'm going to contain myself this evening and just give you a frame and tell you a story, Depestre's story. And in the process, I hope to give you an idea of the questions I think his story raises, both about a time in our modern historical past and about our global present. He's a captivating character with a pretty crazy life story, René Depestre. A story that, if one wanted to be pithy about it, one could sum up in just a few words: love, exile, writing, revolution, in no particular order. In no particular order, because these elements were long inseparable from one another in Depestre's trajectory. Its trajectory that began with his initial exile from Haiti and resettlement in Paris in 1946 at the age of 19, then a move to what used to be Czechoslovakia with sojourns in Germany and Austria, from there to Chile, where he took refuge after being expelled from Czechoslovakia, then on to Argentina and Brazil, back to France briefly, then again to Haiti for a hopeful minute before escaping to Castro's Cuba for 20 years, with missions to the Soviet Union, China, and Vietnam. Then he came back to Paris and finally to the south of France, where he lives and writes to this day at the age of 92. At nearly every port a romance, many poems, an explicit political mission, and an uncomfortable departure. This pattern repeated pretty much throughout the 4 odd decades of the Cold War. Depestre's 40-year experience of crisscrossing 5 continents in pursuit of a dream of socialist revolution is something I've been thinking about in particular lately with respect to vocabulary. The slippery and fraught terminology we use to describe people who leave home, their place of national origin, to go live elsewhere, semi-permanently, indefinitely, forever. We call these people migrants or refugees, immigrants or expatriates. And each one of these terms, of course, connotes certain political and socioeconomic realities. Each one comes with its own baggage. Not sorry about the pun. A lot of ink continues to be spilled in all languages in this semantic debate. Since the 1951 UN Convention on the matter, the term refugee refers to, quote, a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality. A migrant, on the other hand, is understood to have left her or his homeland in pursuit of economic opportunity, but to remain in a state of limbo, as yet unsettled. An immigrant is a migrant who's made it, someone who left home and successfully, if not legally, managed to establish some form of long-term residence in another place. And finally, expatriate names a category of elite migrants, professionals, skilled workers, artists, people who've chosen to live temporarily or permanently outside their native country, folks who, for the most part, can come and go at will. This category includes many of us Institute fellows, here in France, of course. Anyway, over the next few minutes, I want to drill down into the story of Depestre's movement through these overlapping categories of displacement. Because despite the fact of having been run out of more countries than most people visit in a lifetime, Depestre has written and also spoken to me consistently about his life as a story of connections and fortuitous encounters, as the creation of a network of communities, colleagues, co-combatants, and lovers. Just last year, in his memoir, Bonsoir Tendresse, Good Evening Tenderness, he wrote, Loin de me sentir dépaysé ou exilé, je me retrouve plus homme que jamais, à l'opposé de la notion doloriste de l'exil qui emprisonne l'homme dans un pays, une langue, une mentalité, une foi, une prétendue identité. Now, this sentiment may seem naive, utopian, even banal. It certainly doesn't efface the realities of water crossings and other displacements that have come before or since. But insofar as we've been brought here to this institute to imagine alternative approaches to research and pedagogy, both forms of storytelling, after all, I do want to offer Depestre's story as a new narrative of Haitian migration. And that's why I've begun with this photo of Depestre, a migrant on a beach. Because to speak to him, or to read his work, his poetry and his fiction as much as his political essays, his autobiographical reminiscences, to get to know Depestre is to acknowledge that he truly did and does believe that his many unfortunate, at times tragic, personal experiences of coerced displacement were lived and so can be remembered and told from the perspective of his choosing. And I guess this attitude of his has freed me, in a sense, to think about why and how Depestre's story matters to me, why I think it should matter to other people, and why and how to tell it. So, like I said, tonight I want to share with you the bones of the story of Depestre's transcontinental wanderings and give you all a sense or a taste of what the 20th century was like for this Haitian rebel poet, always in exile, and yet somehow insistently everywhere at home. In this time, as you'll hear, Depestre befriended, fought alongside, and collaborated with some of the most influential political and intellectual figures of the last century. And he engaged actively with all the big-name ideologies and philosophical and intellectual currents that define the recent past: negritude, Marxism, Pan-Africanism, Surrealism, among other cultural phenomena. Since 1945, Depestre has written at once intimate and broadly humanist reflections on the coming together of literature and radical politics. And he's also written a large number of very sexy poems. His extraordinary biography and vast bibliography offer a very unique prism through which to consider the decades of the Cold War and well beyond. So I'm going to begin with who Depestre is and where he comes from. He was born and spent the early years of his life in Jacmel, Haiti, which is a coastal town, capital of the Southwest Department of Haiti, known for two things. First, it's anchoring in African and Afro-Creole folk traditions, especially carnival and vaudou, which is Haiti's most widespread religious practice. And then second, for its role as haven for 19th century revolutionaries from across the Caribbean, notably Francisco de Miranda, who created the first national flag of Venezuela in Jacmel in 1806, and also for Puerto Rican nationalist Ramon Betances, for whom Jacmel served as a base in 1870 while he was gathering support for an uprising in the Dominican Republic. Now, Depestre only lived in Jacmel until the age of 14, but much of his writing, both his poetry and prose fiction and his political essays, much of this writing refers directly back to his experiences there, his adolescent romantic encounters, like literally frolickings on the beach with the first girls he liked, and then also his experiences of Vodou, the ceremonies he attended with his mother. Depestre's rememberings of Jacmel also ground his perception of Haiti as a point of departure for thinking about Caribbean liberation more broadly. But his story really gets going in 1945, which is the year the 19-year-old Depestre published his first volume of poetry, Étincelle, which means sparks. Depestre was very much a part of what's considered the post-American occupation generation in Haiti, a generation that, for those who are not aware, sidebar, the United States occupied Haiti from 1915 to 1934 to maintain stability in the interest of making sure American business interests weren't compromised by various political goings-on there, but it's another story. The post-American occupation generation was a generation that condemned both the continued complicity of Haiti's leaders with international forces and the Haitian intelligentsia's adherence to traditional forms and subjects of literature. Now, Depestre wrote Étincelle when he was a student in high school in Haiti's capital, Port-au-Prince, and he literally went door to door asking for money from family, friends, friends of family, family of friends, and anyone else he could find in order to raise $150 for the publication of his first volume of poetry with the Haitian National Press, and it worked. He published Étincelle in April 1945 and improbably became an overnight sensation throughout Haiti. A young poet raging against a national and international machine that had become accustomed to Haiti's submission to foreign powers. In fact, Depestre became enough of a sensation, he made enough money from his volume of poems to finance his first literary venture, a weekly paper called La Ruche, the Beehive, along with 3 other student friends. With its regular column, Letter to Old Men, and other pointed criticisms of both U.S. President Harry Truman and Haitian President Élie Lescaut, a U.S. State Department-backed dictator, the paper was, a thorn in the government's side. Things came to a head in December 1945, immediately following the visit to Port-au-Prince by surrealist poet André Breton, who gave a lecture titled Surrealism and Haiti. Depestre and his colleagues at the paper spent a few days in Breton's company and were blown away by what they heard in Breton's lecture as clear confirmation of what, up until then, had been their more muted call for total revolution in Haiti. They dedicated the very next issue of La Ruche to Breton, taking up the challenge they believed he'd issued, and calling, among else, for the abolition of class distinction in Haiti and for a national commitment to global decolonization. Lescaut's government seized the issue and threw Depestre and his co-editors in jail. This was unsurprising. But it's what happened next that's pretty shocking. Because Depestre was so well known thanks to the success of this poetry collection, his imprisonment, even though it only lasted for a day, was a very big deal. First, university and high school students in the capital went on strike, calling for immediate elections, the release of political prisoners, and freedom of the press. This strike soon developed into a national strike. Store owners, civil servants, teachers, transportation workers. Lescaut was out by mid-month. His regime had effectively been toppled by a cohort of revolutionary poets, a bunch of outraged college students. But alas, success was fleeting. These extraordinary events did not lead to a happy ending to Depestre's story. Instead, a military faction took over after Lescaut's ousting, and once again, Depestre was placed briefly under arrest. And the new government that came into power in August of that same year, pressured by the communist-phobic U.S. State Department, shut down La Ruche and awarded scholarships to Depestre and his fellow troublemakers, encouraging them to pursue their studies abroad. And this began Depestre's lifelong exile from Haiti. First stop was Paris. Depestre showed up here, a Haitian migrant, in early 1946, with the names and contacts of several highfalutin intellectuals in his pocket, thanks to Breton and to Aimé Césaire, who taught a seminar back in Haiti in 1944. Césaire was the one who picked Depestre up at La Gare Saint-Lazare. He was also the one who signed him up with the French Communist Party. Within a month, Depestre had started hanging out with Breton, Paul Éluard, Elsa Triolet, Louis Aragon, Tristan Tzara, Michel Leiris, and the rest of kind of the Parisian cool crowd. Because, of course, Depestre had arrived in Paris with some pretty impressive street cred. He was the Haitian kid poet whose writing had lit the spark of an actual revolution. And this was the Surrealist dream come true. Because whereas the Surrealists had never quite been able to navigate a productive relationship with the French Communist Party, this marriage of poetry and politics had happened, however ephemerally, in Haiti. Not in France, not in Europe, in Haiti, France's former colony, the so-called Third World. So anyway, Depestre fit right in Paris, as much with the international cast of European avant-gardists as with the intellectuals of the Negritude movement from sub-Saharan Africa and the Caribbean. He befriended Senegalese poet Léopold Sédar Senghor, Martinican psychoanalyst at the time, Frantz Fanon, and other folks involved with Présence Africaine, which is the Pan-Africanist magazine, publishing house, and bookstore that's still extant today, right here in the 6th. And he became active in the decolonization movement. But again, alas, this last bit, the anti-colonial organizing, it got him kicked out of France in 1950. In December of that year, he was given 48 hours to get out of the country with his Hungarian wife, journalist and translator Edith Combos-Sorel. Depestre turned for help to Paul Éluard, who pulled some strings with the Czech ambassador to France, who happened also to be a well-known avant-garde painter. And then Depestre and his wife were off to Prague. It was in Prague that Depestre discovered Latin America. He connected with Jorge Amado and Pablo Neruda, both of whom were living there in exile due to their own communist activities in Brazil and Chile, respectively. Amado had read a poem Depestre published about a Brazilian communist rebel and kind of summoned him to meet with him at the Château de Dobris, which was a sort of writer's residency in the 1950s in Czechoslovakia. Things were good for a while. The Depestres settled relatively comfortably into the housing they'd been provided at the university. But soon enough, Depestre's increasingly outspoken criticism of the Stalinist show trials that were happening in Czechoslovakia and elsewhere during the early 1950s placed him square in the government's crosshairs. He and his wife were no longer welcome in the student dorms. But thanks to Amado, who vouched for Depestre as his new secretary, they were granted refuge at the chateau. But this too only worked for so long. Depestre continued in his criticism of the Czech state machine, and by 1952, he was back on the road, forced out of the country. Now, very fortunately, thanks to a long-standing friendship with Cuban poet Nicolas Guillen, whom he'd met prior to leaving Haiti, Depestre and his wife were granted safe passage to Cuba, a trip back across the ocean from Prague to Genoa, Italy, to Havana, Cuba, from Europe back to the Americas, a trip Depestre remembers like this. Après le tunnel tchèque, la beauté des jours et des soirs nous laisse volontiers croire que, sur un paquebot italien, un jeune couple peut observer la trêve que suggèrent l'azur et les vents océaniques, loin des barbaries de l'époque de la guerre froide. But this hopeful sentiment was quickly dashed. They were on that boat in March 1952, during the month, and on the exact day, in fact, when Fulgencio Batista staged a US-backed coup and assumed power in Cuba. Surprise, surprise, these would not be ideal conditions for Depestre to set up house, because one of the first things Batista's new regime would do, part of the deal with the US, was break with the Soviet Union and outlaw the Communist Party. So the Depestres literally learned on the boat that they had gone in the middle of the Atlantic from being refugees to being Soviet spies. They were handcuffed on arrival in Havana, brought to a military camp in Tiscornia, which at the time was called the Ellis Island of Cuba because it had served as a sort of internment camp for Jews fleeing from Europe. 2 months later, they were put right back on the same ship they'd come over in, right back to Europe, and, as Depestre has put it, un jeune couple intellectuel traqué sur les deux rives de la guerre froide. Now, they had no visas, no idea what to expect welcome-wise anywhere in Europe. So while they were on board the ship, they sent out an SOS to the leadership of the Italian Communist Party, which then sent them what amounted to an immigration lawyer who met them at the docks. And this lawyer succeeded in winning them the right to stay in Italy for exactly 1 month, after which time they'd have to find some other European country to take them in. They had the bright idea to sneak back into France, a place they'd been forbidden to return to for a period of 25 years. They managed to hide out in Paris, literally hiding in a communist cardiologist's flat in the 17th. But then one afternoon, they were stopped and asked to show their papers while crossing the Pont Saint-Michel on a daring trip to the Louvre. They found themselves faced with the by now all too familiar, you've got 48 hours. So this time they reached out to Césaire, hoping he'd be able to get the French Communist Party to intervene on their behalf. Césaire kicked the ball to Senghor, who came up with Vienna, Austria as an option. Why Austria? Well, because Austria was hosting the 1952 meeting of the Soviet-backed World Peace Council. The plan was for Depestre to attend as Pablo Neruda's official secretary. And this plan worked. The Depestres made it to Austria for the conference, strings were pulled, and they ended up with papers allowing them to return to Czechoslovakia. From there, it was soon back to Italy, back to the boat, and back across the Atlantic, this time to join Pablo Neruda in Chile. Depestre has described this long 1952 moment of ping-ponging back and forth across the ocean as a period where he made his peace with the fact that the Marxism of his ideals was no longer, maybe never had been, a reality in the Soviet bloc or really anywhere in Europe. That Lenin's vision had succumbed to what he called the, quote, traditional isms of terror. That said, the conclusion he drew in that moment was site-specific. Communism hadn't worked in Europe, but its triumph in the Americas remained potential. Depestre's encounter with Latin America while stranded in the heart of the Stalinist Eastern Bloc, an encounter that had been intellectually enriching and that had provided a literal safe haven, this left him committed to the possibility that where Europe had failed, the Americas, not the US of course, but Latin America and the Caribbean, the idea that the Americas still had a shot. Because let's remember, in 1952, Depestre was a still young man who had seen such a miracle happen before in Haiti. So it was, kind of strangely, in the spirit of hopefulness and faith, that Depestre headed to Santiago, Chile. Ce détour par Prague a valu à ma vie une ouverture sans précédent, puisque, contrairement aux gens de ma génération, aux Haïtiens, qui étaient tournés surtout vers les États-Unis, pour des raisons historiques et politiques, vers le Canada, vers la France, j'en ai, en ce qui concerne, un autre parcours. Aujourd'hui, avec le recul, je mesure l'importance de cette rencontre avec Amado et Neruda. Je me dis que je devrais offrir des fleurs à ceux qui m'ont expulsé de France pour me jeter dans les bras de gens comme ça. Depestre spent about 7 months in Chile, where he helped Neruda and Amado organize the Continental Cultural Congress of 1953. He learned Spanish, and eventually he was invited to Buenos Aires, Argentina, where he became a part of the intellectual circle that included sisters Victoria and Silvina Ocampo, communist activists and founders of an important literary journal. And after just a couple of months in Buenos Aires, he went to join Amado in Sao Paulo, Brazil, where he and his wife spent 2 years working as French professors while actively engaged with the Brazilian Communist Party. He received military training during that time, operating under the alias Walter Miranda. And throughout this time in South America, Depestre was much sought after in revolutionary circles. His Haitian origins were a plus to militant intellectuals hungry to understand themselves in relation to the Americas more broadly, and to Haiti, in particular, birthplace of the American revolutions. Je leur parlais d'Haïti aussi bien que de Cuba, je pouvais les entretenir de l'ensemble de la Caraïbe. I spoke to them of Haiti and Cuba too. I could tell them everything about the whole Caribbean. There are just 3 more stops on this journey worth recounting in this limited time. The first is Depestre's return to Haiti, finally, in 1958. François Duvalier had just been elected to power in 1957, and although Duvalier's rise to the presidency was suspect at best, it seemed nonetheless that Haiti was entering a new phase, a politics of the little guy, and an end to the domination of a mostly fair-skinned urban elite class. History tells us, of course, that this was to be a brutal 30-year dictatorial charade, but at the time, from Depestre's precarious place in France, where he'd returned in 1956 in order to participate in the first International Congress of Negro Writers and Artists, organized by Présence Africaine, at the time, the opportunity to come home, to nation build in Haiti, seemed like a good idea. It was not. Duvalier first welcomed Depestre, even offered to make him foreign affairs minister, but the cordial relations didn't last long. Supported by the CIA and a US State Department willing to look the other way on human rights as long as communism stayed out of Haiti, Duvalier's violent authoritarian regime revealed itself early on. Depestre very quickly ran afoul of the authorities. He began calling openly for resistance to Duvalier and became active in the underground Communist Party. Surveillance, then house arrest, and then basic fear of his life soon followed. Same old story. But Depestre had been paying attention to what was going on politically just 70 kilometers away in Cuba. He'd been following every step of what would become the successful revolution of 1959, and he well understood how Cold War politics had been playing out among the US, Duvalier, and the Dominican dictator Rafael Trujillo, and of course Batista. And he saw Castro and Guevara's revolution as a last bastion of opposition. So he published an article in Haiti's national newspaper in which he situated the Cuban revolutionaries' victory in a long historical context of Latin American freedom fighting. Castro and Guevara noticed it, and through the intermediary of Nicolas Guillen, they invited him to speak at the University of Havana. Duvalier let him make the trip as a goodwill emissary to Cuba's new leaders. Depestre got on a plane in March 1959, and he didn't make it back to Haiti for another 43 years. Depestre credits his Latin American experience, and especially Neruda and Amado's, quote, idée globale de l'Amérique latine, their global idea of Latin America, for his readiness to integrate into Castro's Cuba. Indeed, he spent the next 20 years of his life there, an essential member of the regime and close confidant to both Castro and Guevara from the very beginning. After his wife left him to live in Israel, persuaded by her family not to return to Cuba, he married a Cuban woman and had 2 sons. He participated in the establishment of the national press, for which he traveled multiple times to Moscow and Leningrad, to China and Vietnam. He met with Ho Chi Minh, with Mao Zedong, and with Zhao Enlai. He spent time with Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. He also broadcasted a nightly program in Haitian Creole and French on Radio Habana, Cuba, sending messages to comrades still in Haiti. He wrote for state cultural institution Casa de las Americas and other national publications. All of this until, of course, the regime's incapacity or unwillingness to dissociate from the practices of Stalinism, including its racism and its homophobia, until these practices became impossible for Depestre to ignore. So as of about 1971, as a result of his stance during the Padilla affair and his Leninist ideas about union organizing, which had been outlawed by Castro by then, Depestre was not only cast out of the inner circle of Castro's state, but ultimately back in the familiar position of being surveilled and harassed, the inevitable parallelism of his story. This was the period when he finally broke, with the international communist movement, quote, cette vaste duperie, cette catastrophe, that vast deception, that catastrophe. He resigned his teaching post at the university, having come to realize that his classroom had been infiltrated by government operatives. And he turned to writing a lot. He published his first novel, for example, and he began making plans, of course, to leave. Having been denationalized by Duvalier in Haiti and still forbidden to return to France, the now 50-year-old Depestre once again turned to former comrades in arms. Help came this time through Senegalese Director General of UNESCO, the United Nations Organization for Education, Science, and Culture, Amadou Matar Mbao, a close friend of Leopold Senghor's. It took 2 years, but Mbao got him a gig as secretary. Depestre left Paris in 1978. And though he claimed never to have fallen entirely in line with the ideology of the UN, he did accept an end to what he's since come to see as, quote, les excès politiques, the political excesses of his youth. J'ai vécu douloureusement la débandade générale du socialisme. Ce fut un naufrage personnel de mon esprit et de ma sensibilité. Depestre retired from his UNESCO post in 1986 and settled in the southern French countryside, where he lives, as I said, where he writes to this day. And that's basically it. That's the whole of Depestre's story in just over half an hour. I hope you'll forgive all the name and place dropping, but I wanted you all to realize what I've come to realize since starting to think about how to turn his life into a book. I realized that I could only tell Depestre's story by pulling the threads of his encounters with an incredible cast of 20th century luminaries, writers, artists, political figures from each of the many points on the globe Depestre moved through or inhabited, points on the globe that themselves require deep understanding. And so now, if you'll allow me just a quick coda, one that has to do with this question of storytelling and displacement, I'm going to do just a couple of moments of show and tell, tech permitting. We all say a small prayer right now, which is about to happen. Okay, so the project that I've been working on in earnest here at the Institute is a deep dive into Depestre's world that I'm hoping will not only be a book but about this one man, but also lay out a broader transatlantic network of global South cultural and political actors in motion. Because at every stop on Depestre's trail, he crossed paths, as you've heard, with one or more figures that I realized I needed to gain some purchase on, but didn't really know enough about and wouldn't necessarily have the time to follow in detail around the world in their moments of intersection with Depestre. These were Afro-diasporic figures, especially, who'd also moved around the Atlantic world and beyond for reasons that for the most part have to do with European and US American imperialism. And so in collaboration with a librarian and formidable digital humanities scholar at Columbia, my friend and colleague Alex Hills, who some of you have worked with, I began building a parallel online storytelling venture called In the Same Boats, toward an Afro-Atlantic intellectual cartography. So far, so good. So this site originated in my Depestre research. It was born truly of a need to get a sense of where he was in the world and who might have been there at the same time doing what and how that might have influenced the work that he ended up doing in that place at that time. Like, this was a purely practical endeavor, and I'll show you what it ended up becoming. And the site is going to show the movements of individuals from the Americas, Africa, and Europe within the 20th century Atlantic world. It's designed as a fundamentally collaborative venture. Individual scholars use their expertise to generate unique data sets. Okay, I'm going to say a lot of words like data and spreadsheet, but on like a very basic level, and I'll show you as I tell you how they function. So they use simple spreadsheets like this one. Okay, nope. Like this one. So this is Depestre's data set. But we've got folks in various stages of developing sheets for a number of other figures. So you can basically see what's meant to happen here is the scholar enters a certain amount of information, all cited, all with bibliographical references, that indicate where a person was at any given time. And this data sheet will feed into the visualization that I'm going to show you. So this is Depestre's, as I said, but everyone in blue, these are data sheets that have been assigned editors. So these are individual scholars who are working on their own spreadsheets like that. And on the right are people who, since hearing about the project, have asked us to create data sheets so that they can make maps for the people that they're interested in. And the data set for each one of these figures will generate 2 open access interactive geographic visualizations and 2 archives. The site's actually in development as we speak with our humanities developer, Agile Humanities. So I'll be able to show you here only the skeleton and the basic test functionality. So this is the first visualization, it's the trajectories. And the basic way it works is that you click on someone, René Depestre, and again, this is not how it will be entirely because the visualization is not yet hooked up with the data sheet entirely. This is fake news. Sorry. And then there's a timeline. So if we start with Depestre in, say, the 40s, we start to see kind of broad patterns of where he might have been at any given place and time, if, again, this were working correctly right now. And if you're interested in Depestre, you follow this line, and you just kind of get a sense of where he was in space and time and some general patterns of his movement. But what is meant to be able to happen as well, of course, is that you could then see, well, what was Catherine Dunham up to in this time? What are the points where the two of them might have intersected, and from what time? And then if you're a scholar working on these Afro-Atlantics figure, one or more, you can then drill down into this information and start to develop your own projects with respect to that. And there's 2 visualizations. There's this, which is kind of the narrative sort that shows the movement based on the figures. And then there are the intersections, which is a more of a site base. So if you look at this Mercator map, which is what we're working with right now, and you say you're interested in the late 1940s to the mid-50s, you can see in Paris, France, who was there. And the contrast isn't working as well as it should, but you can maybe notice that there's some lighter and darker. The dark ones mean that person was definitely there then. The lighter ones mean we're not certain about it and more research needs to be done. So the site itself is meant to be a call to other scholars to verify, to enhance, to correct, etc., so that we can really have a broader portrait of what's happening in the Afro-Atlantic world in the 20th century. And these first 2 iterations, the trajectory, the visualizations of trajectories and the intersections, this is kind of big picture, right? Comparative movement, geographical hotspots in any given year or period of time, and or watershed moments. But then there's also a search function, which, not much, but hold on, a search function which comes from the notes section of the spreadsheet. So basically up to where it says citation 2, that's all stuff that appears in the visualization. Everything after that is gravy. The notes section is searchable and means that any terms that a scholar parks in there, in what essentially is an archive, an individual archive for a scholar, any notes that they put in there are searchable. So we only have a few figures up there now. You saw only 6 of the 50 we'll eventually have. But if you put in something like Pan-African for these 6, let's say, you find from the notes section all the figures that would have been perhaps at a Pan-African festival or participating in a Pan-African journal, etc. Another good one for that matter would be probably festival. Yeah, so we get some people. But you can imagine that once there are more figures, the search terms can be more specific, more interesting, more helpful. You can put the names of journals, you could put the names of performances, anything you can imagine really that might figure in another scholar's notes about the character or the figure that they're working on. So this project was very much inspired by The fact of Depestre's deeply networked existence and the extent to which his travels placed him in physical and intellectual proximity to so many other important 20th century cultural actors. By literally mapping the network of Afro-Atlantic intellectual, political, and aesthetic contributors in the 20th century, Same Boats is a workaround with respect to the border drawing that too often hinders transcolonial dialogue because of issues of language, because of the fact that the academy is kind of segmented into Francophone, Anglophone, Hispanophone, Lusophone departments. So this is something that is meant to, as I said, work around the borders that are established in our scholarly lives across the various nations of Europe, Africa, and the Americas. But again, for me, Same Boats has been first and foremost another way to see Depestre's story, and frankly, to get help from the widest possible academic network as I work out how to tell it. A way to see Depestre fully plugged in to his world. So to end, I'll just say it's been a while since Depestre has been engaged in global politics in the ways I've described. He spent the years since his retirement living a life very different from the one that took him all over the world in the latter half of the 20th century. It's a much quieter life. He lives in a modest villa, it's a modest villa in a nondescript French village where I've had the chance to visit with and interview him many times. And that rainbow is not photoshopped, it actually occurred in real life. This villa is a home he purchased with money from one of the many literary prizes he's won in the last 35 years. He's written profusely in that time from his retirement in the south of France, fiction as well as chronicles of various periods in his life, also a number of essays advocating for non-identitarian, non-racialized human community. He's called for a reimagination of the relationship between France and nations of the global south. He's even become a French citizen. And he's turned away from radical politics entirely. This later life position of relative remove has, I'd say, tainted Depestre's legacy to an extent. A quick run through Google Scholar or Google Books will bring you to article after article, essay after essay, basically calling him a sellout, implying or downright accusing him of having conveniently dropped all that revolution business to get a slice of the world literature pie. To those critics, I say, right. So when's the last time you launched a popular revolution and became a 40-year intermittent migrant in service to a politics of anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist human solidarity, only to witness firsthand that dream being hijacked time and again by paranoid, self-interested, unscrupulous former allies? This will not necessarily go in the book, but it will be implied. The last time I went to see Depestre was in the late spring of last year. I sat by his bedside because a bout of sciatica meant he couldn't sit up or walk at the time. I sat there and I listened to him tell me stories. We were drinking cider and eating peanuts. His wife, Nellie, who'd had a stroke a few years back, was in her room with an aide. At one point in our long conversation, Monsieur Depestre said to me, "Isn't it funny, my dear, how they're taking care of us here in France? You see, we have a nurse. She's here 3 times a week. And a very nice lady comes every day now and massages my back, and I don't pay a penny. Isn't that something? French socialism. I spent my whole life trying." And then he laughed. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for writing about one of the most important Haitian literary figures. Can you talk a little bit about his literary work? I mean, I don't want to, I'm afraid of people getting away thinking he was just a political animal.
Yeah, so what is it, 12 volumes of poetry, 3 novels, 2 short stories collections, 8 or 9 essay collections. He was a writer. Kind of part of my answer to Tash as well was that, and where I began, inseparable poetry, writing, and politics. So he was a prolific writer and a committed writer of erotic poetry, of political poetry, of real marvelous novels, of political tracts. He was someone who, his activism was not, it was not an either or. As some of you may know, I translate Depestre. My scholarly work includes theoretical analyses of his poetics and of his prose, and that's what really brought me to him. But more I read, obviously, more I wanted to understand how he managed that with these peregrinations. In fact, one kind of through line I considered as the hook for this book is the fact that he traveled in all of these places, it gradually diminished over time. He started with a library of 5,000 books that he left Paris with to Czechoslovakia the first time. He now has about 2,000 of them, meaning this was literature, reading, poetry was an intimate and integral part of his understanding of himself, even as he was working with Che, active in the Brazilian resistance, et cetera, et cetera. So he's an extraordinary poet and novelist as well. The number of prizes are too long to list, but he is recognized throughout the world, throughout Europe, et cetera. The one thing I will say, and I ended on that somewhat sad note about his legacy, and part of the reason I wanted to write about him is that in American post-colonial studies especially, the fact that he turned away from the militant politics, as I mentioned, has made him difficult to place and accept as a literary figure in some ways, because so many of the folks he came up with in the 50s and 60s, like Césaire, like Senghor, all the folks from Présence Africaine, stayed committed in a certain way to Pan-Africanism and socialism, and he so enthusiastically participated and radically separated. So, yeah, thanks.
Si vous me permettez de poser ma question en français, je serai moins ridicule qu'en anglais.
Si vous parlez lentement, je peux traduire.
C'est un tout petit détail, mais c'est quelque chose qui m'a toujours intriguée dans les exils de Depestre. C'est comment on peut expliquer qu'il a été chassé de France au début des années 50, alors qu'il y avait beaucoup de communistes en France dans les années 50, évidemment. Donc, qu'est-ce qui a fait qu'il a été exclu à ce moment-là? Et d'une manière plus générale, quelle part vous faites entre les archives historiques et les récits de Depestre?
Great questions. Okay, so the first question was, given that there were so many other active communists in Paris in the 1950s, why did Depestre end up getting kicked out? What did he do that was so bad? And then the second part of the question, to what extent do I give value to the archive, the big archive, the smaller archives, et cetera, and to what extent do I give value to the stories that Depestre tells? Which, fellows, you will see is my second question that I'm going to need help with from you tomorrow during the workshop. Funny enough, I'm going to keep it on there because I want to talk about this. But to the first question, and I mentioned it, but maybe not forcefully enough, it was his anti-colonial activism. In fact, this is the same thing that got, so this was something that was not uncommon. I'm telling Depestre's story, but he's not the only one that got kicked out for arguing against empire in France in the 1950s. The thing was, he was Francophone, but he was not French. He was Haitian, who already enjoy a precarious relationship, shall we say, to the French state. He was warned multiple times, but the fact of being an anti-colonial activist was what the real impetus for having him sent out of France was. This was also a time, you can think, I don't know how familiar you are with the literature of the period or the figures of the period, but Edouard Glissant also, later in like 1960, right, he was made to stay in France, so he couldn't go back to Martinique and talk about anti-colonialism.
That's what Glissant says. That's what Glissant says.
That's what Glissant says and writes. It is true. But this being said, we do, and one can think about the Parti colonial in the I'm not going to do this whole history here right now, but basically we're in the post-war moment. So we're after 1945, we're after Brazzaville, right, 1944. All the French came together in Africa to figure out, well, what are we going to do? We just got saved from colonialism by Hitler, but we have colonies. This is super awkward. How can we manage this kind of, hypocrisy, essentially, right? So the Parti Communiste was doing, the Parti Colonialiste was doing a lot of propaganda work to convince the French public that colonialism was A, not a bad thing, that B, the colonials kind of liked it for reasons of hospitals and roads and medicines, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but that we could find the French could find some sort of gradual transition from being an empire to being a federation. Those who were calling out that as an impossible post-war situation were anathema, and Depestre figured in that group. And the second part of your question about the archive, I don't know. And in fact, I have come up against situations, you said earlier, that's what Glissant says, right? I've come up to situations where the archive is telling me something different than what Depestre told me. That's the problem with having a 90-year-old subject of inquiry. He's still telling me stuff, and he was there, but he also has a story of his life. You know, he has a story. So part of the effort that I'm making in telling this story, I mean, you guys just got the overview, and it's broad strokes, obviously, but I do have to drill down and cross-check, and that's part of the reason for this site, is to call to other scholars who were also there to maybe corroborate or nuance, etc. Something's happening. Okay. In any event. So, yes, I don't have a full answer to that, but that's part of the answer. Thank you for the question.
Speaking of archives, do you know what will happen to his own papers? Has he made a decision as to where his archive will go?
I do know, and I'm so happy. He has, over the past 3 years, I guess it is, or maybe even a little bit longer, he's been steadily depositing his archive at La Bibliothèque Francophone Multimédia de Limoges, of all places. So I spend a fair amount of time, I will be submitting receipts, I spend a fair amount of time back and forth while I'm here, which has been amazing. He just deposited the last third, the installment number 3 of his archive in January. So they're safe, they're taken care of. His library, and he's even put in this archive in Limoges, his whole, that collection of 2,000 books I mentioned, his entire library is there as well. So, you know, l'embarras, an embarrassment of riches. Yeah.
Hi, Kaiama.
Hey,
thank you so much for that story. I really agree with you that the story of Depestre's life is this kind of rich example of thinking about movement and political engagement that we don't see very much. So thank you. I had a kind of similar question to Korat about the anti-colonial organizing that he was doing in Paris, and you know what that precipitated, and it just got me thinking around like what you said at the end about French socialism and the way in which the anti-colonial organizing that he was doing, in a way, is like what we all get to benefit from, you know, in terms of like living in a less racist France than in 1952 or whatever. And so I was wondering, in connection to the question of anti-colonial organizing, his relationship in Cuba to Afro-Caribbean artists and intellectuals. And I'm wondering if, because I know that it's not in any of Depestre's writing, I mean, a little bit, you know, there's some things, but the entire world of that life is something that he really doesn't write so much about in his autobiography and that kind of thing. So I'm wondering if you've done that archival work or kind of sought that stuff out, and what does that look like?
So the first thing I'll tell you, you'll be very excited if you haven't seen them already, he put his journals from 1960 to 1978. He kept a journal almost daily, and the journals are called the Cuba journals.
In Limoges.
In Limoges. And I actually have them in PDF if you want. But yeah, so that story is there, but what's interesting nonetheless is that it's not in his published writings. You're absolutely right to say that. And I'll have to think through, I have a suspicion as to why that's the case. And this again goes back to Tasha's question. It was incredibly disappointing. All right, so if we're thinking about his trajectory up to Cuba as, okay, this is it, like we have the socialist revolution. It happened in the Caribbean, it might spread to Haiti, it might spread to the DR. Like there is a hopefulness in his involvement in the revolution in Cuba that slowly but surely is being eaten away by the realities he's seeing in his proximity to the establishment, right? And one of those issues, as many people are well aware, was race. And the virulent racism that persisted in Haiti well after, in Haiti, but yeah, well in Cuba, well after the revolution, and that really being something that the Achilles heel, the black sheep, that's probably the worst metaphor, but the thing about the revolution that he could never quite square. And so in the last thing he wrote, Bonsoir Tendresse, there are little moments where he talks about the racism he experienced in Cuba, but he tends to not want to almost sully the positive aspects of that experience and that that experiment by talking too much and parsing the racial situation there, you know. And one of the things that I want to do next is figure out his relationship to the tricontinental, which was so much plugged into U.S. civil rights and was constantly talking about race. I haven't found anything, and I'm still, I mean, it's a daily journal. I'm in 1966 right now. I'm still making my way through it, but I haven't yet found anything where he explicitly talks about anti-racist organizing and anti-colonial organizing in Cuba. He's very protective of Cuba, even to this day, and even despite the disappointments that he felt there. It's a great question. We'll talk more, obviously, you and I. Yeah, Bob.
Thank you very much for your talk. My question is about the digital project that you have, because it's this new digital form of storytelling, like you were saying, that reveals a lot. It reveals a lot of connection, a lot of stories. But I'm wondering what gets erased or what gets silenced because of this new form of storytelling.
Yeah, that's a question. That is, so I have an answer that I have, because it is the question also, right? If we're talking about, the reason I did it in part was to open up stories and to make a more inclusive portrait of the 20th century. But as soon as you have a data set, as soon as you have a group and you have a line that says, okay, no more. Ours is 50, because after 50, it'll just be a big blur black dot. Visually, it won't help anyone. So, but we did think about that as we were building this, and our answer, the best that Alex and I came up with, is that all the tech behind the site, every last drop of it is on what's called GitHub, which is a repository, open access, meaning anyone can take the tool we built, plug in their own names, and recreate our site with whatever data set they wanted. It could be unwed mothers traveling throughout the United States. It could be dancers in the 20th century. It could be any scholarly community one wanted to establish, you could do with the same technology that we have. You write to us, our email is on the landing page, and we give you the link to the GitHub, because you can't tell everybody's story. And I remember the first time I presented on this project, someone from the audience said, well, yeah, I mean, that's great, it's all well and good, you have all the big names up there, but what about people like, and I'm not being facetious at all, what about people like my grandmother? She was a local organizer in this part of Barbados, for example. And I said, you know, at the time we only had 10 people. I'm like, well, write to me. Do you want to do a data set on your grandmother? We can do that. But there is a time when we have to put the gate down and say, we can't fit anymore. However, go forth and prosper. You know, take this tool and make it your own. And the other thing about it being open access and having this repository is that any of the scholars, that they can take that data set, which is an archive in and of itself, they can raise whatever money they want or dip into their own research funds, and they can produce any visualization they want. So ours is super bare bones, because part of what we were committed to was making it cheap and lightweight, so that you can use it on a phone in the Caribbean or in places that don't have robust internet connections or like big screens to look at pretty websites. But you could take any one of those data sets and make something super fancy with all the bells and whistles. It's a really open platform, as like our best effort at addressing concerns like the one that you've raised. Thanks.
First of all, thanks a lot. It was such an exciting talk. It's inspiring, really, to hear you give. I also wonder about form. At one point, you said, as a biographer, and then you went on, and you're building this site that will be a teaching tool, I suppose, but it could also be something more. In our group, we have people who are moving through and building novels and building musical works. And the people working with language are doing all sorts of things, and I wonder, you've got all this material. There's a kind of standard 2-volume biography, which is one way to look at it. There are biographical essays, and there also could be online ways of putting it together. Have you decided on one or the other of these?
No. Well, all my questions for you guys tomorrow are going to be then redundant, but I'm glad that you're willing to engage them, because there's like as I keep saying it, it's my first time. I would like to be as daring as I dare. I could imagine trying to write this story the way I tried to tell it, as not necessarily as a standard biography, but as a series of essays, as a fairy tale, as a journey that follows his books across the different parts of the world as they're impounded or sent to the wrong place, or meet up with him and end up occupying a room in a chateau where he's kind of crashing. Things. There are different ways into this story. The platform, the website, is a reflection of, all it is potential. All it is a foundation that anyone could tell, including me, could tell any story from. And I don't know how I want to tell this story. This year that I'm here, I've been spending, again, the proximity to Limoges, I've been spending just gathering data. And it really struck me, the conversation we had last week around Tasha's work, when do you stop getting the research? And I haven't had that problem because I'm a literary theorist. I can stop whenever I want to make an argument, and like, boom, that's that, but I feel very compelled with this huge, beautiful archive to explore every corner of it, right? And then also to say, oh, wait, but Jacques-Stéphane Alexis was here too. Maybe I should see what he was up to. Oh, he was hanging out with, Senghor here. I'm gonna have to go to Senegal with Senghor for a minute. And, so I don't know. This year has been about getting the stuff and then maybe seeing what is most interesting to me as a storytelling, because I'm really early in this practice, in this project.
Hi. This is so beautiful. Really, I've enjoyed this. I'm kind of curious about the last piece, the legacy, and what Depestre might be thinking about his legacy, and are you having conversations around that? The fact that you're even having conversations is just so amazing. So thank you.
It's funny. That seems like an obvious question. I feel so protective of him in ways, and I haven't it's like not the elephant in the room, because when I go to see him, he just talks and talks and talks. Like, he has a lot to say, and a lot of threads that I just really sit there and nod and eat peanuts and kind of like fangirl. But I haven't asked him that tough question about, what does it feel like I don't even know if he knows. I suspect he wouldn't care that much. My mom, whenever I have a fight with her and we come to this point of disagreement, she says to me, I stand on my life. And then it's like, that's the end of the fight, because you got 30 years on me, and definitely, and I kind of feel like that would be his answer. Like, really, I stand on my life. If you people want to kind of take it apart and look at my, what I said in 2005 about some politician, or the fact that I haven't been back to Haiti since 2005, and I only was there for 3 days then, why I don't live there anymore, have at it. But he stands on his life in as far as I can tell. Maybe, I'm seeing him next month, maybe I will be inspired to start a little bit, but yeah. Those people make me mad. It makes me angry to have that sort of 92 years, that's, he really, if he's tired and if he's mad at revolution, it's like, anyway, sorry. Are we good?
Any further questions?
I think we're good.
That was a wonderful way to end the discussion.
Thanks.
And thank you very much for a very inspiring and thought-provoking talk.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, everyone.